Good morning, everybody. My name is Vasilis Trigkas. I'm an assistant professor of global affairs at Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University, and it's a very distinct privilege today to be here surrounded by three extraordinary strategic intellectuals to talk about geopolitics and infrastructure. So I have on my right Professor Ambassador General Karl Eikenberry, with a very rich experience in the cutting edge of strategic insight, and also a professor at Tsinghua University at Schwarzman College. I have Professor Tang Xiaoyang, the chair of the Department of International Relations and a foremost expert on China's relations with the Global South and Africa. And also, last but certainly not least, Professor Athanasios Platias, professor of strategy at the University of Piraeus and advisor to 3-4 Greek prime ministers in the past decades about national security. All right, so today the topic is going to be the geopolitics of infrastructure, and the way I was thinking about this has to do with what I believe was a serious inflection point that changed the mentality for which the great powers operated with each other. So if you go back in 2017, before that era, before perhaps the national security strategy of the Trump administration, great powers engaged with each other in a positive sum thinking. Positive sum thinking means that it was the absolute benefits that really mattered. So if there was a Chinese port built in Athens, the port of Piraeus, that made connectivity and logistics more efficient, the United States would be happy because global trade would be more efficient. But I think since 2017, the mentality of great powers has shifted to relative benefits. Zero-sum thinking. And in that mentality, if I win, but you win more, then I'm not content. And so if we have infrastructure projects across the world that somehow affect relative gains, then geopolitics enter the strategic equation. Why is that so? Because over time, the accumulated differential of benefit might lead to power redistribution. Now, this is not my novel thinking. I think all great thoughts have already been introduced before. So if we go back to the turn of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, Halford Mackinder, the founding father of geostrategy, he framed the technology and infrastructure of the Tsarist regime connecting Eurasia through the Trans-Siberian Railway as a game changer for the balance of power. And so according to the geostrategic theory, if you integrate a continent with infrastructure and connectivity, then that might really affect geopolitics. So what I would like to do right now is to ask the very distinguished speakers today to think out loud about geopolitics of infrastructure and connectivity. And I would like to begin with Professor General Ambassador Karl Eikenberry, please.
Are we on here?
I think, yes.
Well, it's good to, very good to be here. Vasilis, thank you for the invitation. And also very good to be with my friend Tang Xiaoyang, and now I can say my old friend, Professor Platias. The Chinese have the expression, when you meet the first time that you're a new friend, but you meet the second time, you're an old friend. So we met yesterday morning, so now you're an old friend. And delighted to be here at the forum. I thought what would be helpful, Vasilis, is in this first round to lay out why infrastructure is important to commercial operators and very important to military operators. And I think what we see is that it's very contingent upon a range of factors. So let me list 7 here. Number 1 would be that the investments that a country puts in, a company puts in, that they have confidence that they're going to get a rapid, steady return on those investments. A second would be the idea of market penetration, so that you go in with infrastructure developments, ports, airfields, and that is really opening up then market expansion. And that's very much the British model of the 1800s and the early 1900s, and I think it fits neatly with China's economic strategy. Then fourth, with those investments that are being made, it's possible for a country then to develop synergy and to gain certain externalities that come with the presence of the infrastructure and the market penetration. So then you end up with the terms of trade within a particular region declining, and you get certain advantages that come with this. A fourth would be in critical resources within a particular region of the world. So going forward and making investments and getting infrastructure so that the critical resources can be mined, extracted, and then transported onto the home country. You see this, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where over 70% of the world's cobalt is produced. Another key location that nations and militaries aim for in setting up infrastructure are on international choke points. So you see in the Red Sea, then in the Bab, that strong desire by countries to put in ports at that location, which would give them the control of that critical location. A sixth is in the setting up of military bases themselves, ensuring that they have access. Those become more difficult because in order to have a successful naval base, you're going to have the stocking of ammunition, stocking of special kinds of fuels. You'll have to have the capabilities of maintenance and repairmen there with the supplies that they need in order to repair ships, and possibly shipbuilding capabilities there as well. And then last, as you look at infrastructure development, it's a question of strategic stability or strategic flexibility. So in the case of China now has 90% of its exports are by sea, and that's over the world average of 80%, so vulnerable in that category. And then it can only export from its eastern coast, unlike the United States, which has the Pacific Ocean on the west, the Atlantic Ocean on the east, the Caribbean Sea to the south. China only has one frontier, 4 sea ship ports, so it's critically strategically. And it also has a degree of vulnerabilities as it goes to Southeast Asia and goes through the Strait of Malacca. So that's a critical point. So the strategic flexibility can come if you can devise and produce diverse routes on land and give the enemy, so to speak, multiple dilemmas as they try to block the trade coming out. Then they're confounded because there may be 3 or 4 different routes, and the combination of them can scatter the forces and cause problems for them militarily.
Well, perfect. How about Professor Tang Xiaoyang? What's your perspective on the geopolitics of infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this very important topic and also inviting me to discuss with excellent panelists. And so for me, the infrastructure actually, its importance can be interpreted with country's vision. In fact, as you mentioned, 2017, that marks a turning point, because before that, it was still quite a lot of globalization, this trend. And while after that, then the deglobalization and decoupling, these voices, they are escalating. That actually represents two visions. So on the one hand, it's globalization. It's saying we need to find out maximize the benefits for the whole group, for the whole world, and then everybody can take their comparative advantage, also get benefits. So in that connection, then the infrastructure, especially global, international infrastructure, they make a platform for the globalization trend. While after that, then the infrastructure is, because of this deglobalization, then people think more about their own national interests or even some group interests, and especially those countries which promotes deglobalization, right? So therefore, then the infrastructure correspondingly is seen more as a weapon or as an instrument to reach their own interest, instead of providing like a public goods platform for the whole community. So I think, however, as we also see, the deglobalization, they do not happen in all over the world. In fact, China and the other like developing countries, in total what we call the global south, like also BRICS as a group, they are still favoring globalization. They just lament how some advanced economies, they no longer see these benefits of global cooperation. So therefore, then they are still promoting global trade, and correspondingly they are promoting infrastructure, no matter maritime or the over the land or the ports and the digital infrastructure. That's also very important. So I think this part is still there. But what's interesting is the countries who want to do this decoupling, de-risking, or de-globalization, as they like, but actually they refer to some similar thinking of just building the economic benefits rather for emphasize their own priority interest. For these countries, they find even when you do not provide like a global platform, public goods, but you still need to work with some like a friend shoring, or you need to offer some competitive infrastructures. So what's interesting I saw is during last 5-6 years, actually this competition in global infrastructure actually paradoxically actually increase, because the US or Europe, they haven't invested in infrastructure heavily, or especially not in other developing countries for maybe 3 decades. But now they also call for global gateway or for the PGII. No matter how they implement it, but at least this is on their political agenda. So I think this is the infrastructure, their influence on geopolitics is first then decided by their vision of geopolitics, their political agenda, and then this will make their like understanding of the infrastructure differently. And then, however, to achieve this geopolitical goal, both, then in today's world, this interlinked global economy, its effect, this actually even compare this decoupling or deglobalization effort still need to put more emphasis on infrastructure.
Right, thank you very much, Professor Tang. The idea of geopolitics being the imperative, the driver behind intense competition on infrastructure is very interesting. Professor Platias, what's your take?
Well, let me supplement what the other said. First of all, the connection between infrastructure and geopolitics is under-researched. There are not a lot of books, a lot of articles on this. And this is really surprising because we live in an era that there is an infrastructural race. I mean, countries are competing on infrastructure. Let's start with the Chinese mega pharaonic project on BRI, or what the Japanese are doing, what the Americans are doing, what the Europeans are doing with Global Gateway. So we are having right now in the current international system an infrastructural race. So it's very important that we try to understand this connection. Vasilis, let me comment on your introductory remarks. Power is always relative. And because it's relative, the name of the game is relative games. So there were always countries who are competing. That win-win thing doesn't work in the international system. It's always one win, the other is losing. Let me give you an example. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, the Ottoman Empire lost. It lost revenues. And one of the reasons that it declined was of the economic problems associated with losing these revenues. And then you had the collapse several decades later. Now that the Suez Canal is more or less closed, or 50% of the traffic has declined, Egypt is losing, and some other countries, for example, like Greece and the port of Piraeus and others are winning. So always the infrastructure plays with the relative power in the international system. Now, let me try to make this connection between geopolitics and infrastructure more clear, starting with what you said, with McIntyre. McIntyre, a British gentleman writing in the beginning of the 20th century, realized that the power of his country, England, United Kingdom, was raised on the control of the seas. And controlling the seas, you meant controlling the trade, it meant wealth, therefore it propelled England at the top of the international system. And to do that, to generate this power, of course, the British had to invest on infrastructure from shipbuilding to ports, to trading ports all over the world. In the beginning of the century, it realized that technology, as you correctly said, created the preconditions for uniting Eurasia. So the unification of Eurasia, because of its resources, will generate more power. And the idea there is technology and connectivity generates power. So that way we come to the three basic constituents of the definition of geopolitics. One is where power is located, power on the map. And power needs to expand from center to periphery, and infrastructure is important. A route, for example, a land route, it allows power to be extended on the periphery. So that's really the first definition of geopolitics, where power is located. The second definition is the location of resources. According to McIntyre, if you can control Eurasia that has more resources, you can generate more resources to compete with the oceanic powers. But you see, to be able to take the advantage of the resources, you have to invest on infrastructure, from extraction, let's say, of energy, or railroads, or land routes. And the third is connectivity, which is the most important. And connectivity, it's transportation, rail, roads, air, but also energy. And because technology is currently changing, it's also digital. So connectivity is the third dimension of geopolitics, and infrastructure is very central to that concept. I mean, let's take sea power. Without canals like Suez or Panama, you cannot extend your power all over the world. Without port, without logistical hubs, everything is infrastructure. That's quite surprising that it's an unresearched topic. Let me try to give another example with energy. In order to bring another dimension, geopolitics doesn't only take place on building infrastructure. It takes place also by destroying infrastructure or disturbing. Let's take the situation, the energy situation in Europe. I mean, for many decades, part of the European prosperity was linked to the pipelines that were connecting Europe with Russia and providing cheap energy to Europe. Look what happened with the war in Ukraine. All this traditional infrastructure either have been destroyed, like the Nord Stream route, or other routes connecting, for example, Russia with Europe via Ukraine or Belarus, are now inactive. Therefore, the geopolitics of infrastructure does not play a role only in connectivity, but also destroying connectivity, which is part of the geopolitical game. And when you destroy this type of connectivity, you have to build new one. Look what's happening in Europe right now. Around Europe, there are hundreds of regasification units being built right now in order to connect Europe with American energy through regasification unit and LNG. And I want to bring a couple of, very shortly, other dimensions. Infrastructure doesn't only relate to security, it's related to prosperity, to economic, but also to ideological, because if you start connecting people, ideas spread. So that's another dimension. And lastly, infrastructure says a lot of things about the long-term strategy of a country. You see, strategies can change overnight, but you know, infrastructure takes years and decades to build, and this has more permanent characteristics, which actually outlives its originators and its architects. So if you really want to understand the grand power of the country, you should look where it puts its money and where infrastructure is being built.
All right, speaking about infrastructure as a creator of power instead of, destroying infrastructure, I know in your work you have introduced the concept of leadership and infrastructure, and you talked about Themistocles, who with the Port of Athens, which was an infrastructure project, the Piraeus port, he managed to turn Athens into a thalassocratic empire. And so how do you connect the creation of infrastructure with the rise of great powers? And thinking of China today, the Chinese are spending perhaps an order of magnitude more on infrastructure than other great powers, certainly much more than the United States. So how do you see the idea of creating infrastructure as generation of power and potentially leading to great powers rising?
That's a great question, Vasilis, and it also brings the importance of leadership and visionary leadership, and also to have the capacity to implement vision. The example that you mentioned, Themistocles, is a great example. Athens was a city-state, mostly agricultural. Its economic resources was agriculture in the Attica. And it faced an existential threat. A huge empire, the Persians, which is actually a collection of empires. The Medes, the Lydians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians invaded Greece, which were independent city-states, like the warring period in China. And the city-state has to withstand an empire. So in order to do that, what Themistocles did, first of all, it built a maritime infrastructure, and it created a huge war-making capacity by building Trigkas, which is used to deny the victory of the Persians over Athens and the Greece. But then, most importantly, in order to protect his country, he built a great wall, a huge infrastructure project. And by the way, building 200 Trigkas and also building walls around Athens and Piraeus were very expensive, huge infrastructure projects, especially for that age, and needed public money but also private money, and the cooperation between public and private financing. So by building the walls, it completely transformed Athens for a vulnerable city-state to an island. And by building a huge naval power, he could control Eastern Mediterranean, he could protect his allies, it could generate wealth. With this wealth, it will build more fleet, more infrastructure, so we have a virtuous circle that propelled Athens into a great power and changed the balance of power in the international system. And most importantly, the model that Themistocles and the ancient Athenians developed, it was imitated by other sea powers.
All right, perfect. So we do have the model of infrastructure generating power. So let me go to General Eikenberry, and I'm going to be blasphemous today, and I'm going to ask you a question about maritime power. So asking a general, an army general, about naval power in China. So China has built significant naval infrastructure, hundreds of ports across the world. They have very advanced soft infrastructure too, like Logink, which is a software system that is able to coordinate, gather data from hundreds of ports and optimize with artificial intelligence logistics. And as you know, logistics is the currency of power when it comes to even military, potentially military usages. And so how do you think Chinese maritime infrastructure, is that a fear in the United States that China has the shipyards, China has the ports, and China could potentially challenge American dominance over the oceans by an infrastructure strategy?
Well, Bas, as you mentioned, I was an Army general, and what would I have to say about Navy operations? Actually, when I went to West Point as a young cadet and studied military history, the first military history books we studied was the Greco-Persian Wars. We studied Thucydides, and one of the deep lessons that we drew as young cadets, as Army cadets, was the value of sea power. And for much of my career thereafter, I was in the Asia-Pacific region and had an opportunity to get a deep understanding of the role of the Navy. The Navy would continually tell us Army officers that 30% of the world is covered by land, 70% is covered by water. But our response to that was, yes, but 100% of human beings live on that land. But then the Air Force, their response was that, well, 100% of the world is covered by air. So we would have arguments about who is the most decisive. But for the what we're talking about here, clearly the Navy and the air power are important. A couple of points that when we have these discussions about China, the United States trying to get ports and access, frequently we don't bring into the discussion the most important actor. And the most important actor is the one who's on the receiving end of the port, or the receiving end of the naval port that's being built. You know, at Schwarzman College in Beijing, I once talked to an African student, and he was talking about infrastructure that had gone by his home, and it was built by a Chinese company. And he said that for the first time in his life now, this village had a road going by it, and this was a farm-to-market road. Never dreamed of having this, and it had transformed their economic life. We talked about how that project was built, and he said perhaps the reports were maybe 30% corruption was involved in this. But did that really matter? They had their road. It was transformational. So as sides compete against each other for infrastructure development, it's incumbent upon them to have a product to offer that can compete favorably against what they're telling the other side should not be put in. And that's important. In terms of what the United States is doing right now with allies, there are some programs that are underway. There's the EU Global Gateway. There's the U.S. Defense Finance Company. President Biden began the Build Back Better World. That program now has morphed into the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. There's other programs that are underway, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, making some progress. At the same time, China is pulling back on some of the spending that it was doing over the last 15 years. So there is a degree of competition that's going on out there, and my own view is that that kind of competition is exactly what's needed, because it's giving then the users in the developing South, it's giving them alternatives to choose from. And if you have just one country operating in one area, then that's going to be the monopoly.
Well, that's perfect, because the perfect pass for Professor Tang Xiaoyang, his book about coevolutionary pragmatism and China-African relations really examines a lot of interactions when it comes to developing finance and infrastructure. So how do you see the global South, Africa? What do they really want? So Karl Eikenberry, Ambassador Eikenberry said, well, they might be able to play the great powers against each other and be benefited by, gaining more funding, gaining more support. So how do you see the Africans and the global South in this race for infrastructure? And let me just give you the number. I think we have a deficit of $1 trillion a year when it comes to infrastructure spending. We still need $1 trillion a year for the next 10 years just to cover the deficit of infrastructure. And we don't have that spending.
The number is always calculated by the World Bank.
Right.
But when it comes to practice, actually, Africa and the global South now have even debt stress. Namely, they already have too much debt, and they cannot borrow money or invest to build a new infrastructure. And this is actually a dilemma in the global South. So for them, maybe the global power, they will benefit them a little bit in this through competition, but actually too much geopolitical tension also will harm their interest. I think for most of them, then the sustainable development is more important. That's also Chinese experience. Actually, when you see the last 40 years, in each year, China may not be the top performer. Some countries like Angola, Ethiopia, they sometimes get also 20% GDP growth per year. But actually, the next 2 years, then they collapsed. And this turbulence actually harm a lot. That's also related to infrastructure, as Professor Platias mentioned. It's a long-term thing, strategic thing. You need to have this sustainability and also stability, peace, to keep it growing. And so for China, then also related to your question on this maritime power, I would say currently, actually the Great Britain that time was kind of one of the few really European sea powers, while other countries, they do not really have such a demand or awareness yet. But currently, actually, every country in the world, almost they know the importance of maritime, of port. So therefore, even when China is building, that's not as the same as the Great Britain in the 19th, 18th century, because China cannot dominate. Suez Canal, Panama Canal, they all belong to these independent countries. China is just cooperating with them. And I think to have a good cooperation, then we need indeed the leadership or the prudence, or what Phronesis, the ancient Greeks said, the practical wisdom to see where, in which manner, and what time to build the infrastructure so that they can keep sustainable development.
Well, thank you, Professor Tang. I really love the concept of practical wisdom. That's a very Aristotelian take. And so we don't have much time. Very quickly, Ambassador Eikenberry. So how do you think smaller countries and big powers can be prudent? How can we turn breakneck rivalry into a more constructive, progressive engagement on development and infrastructure? What should the U.S. be doing?
Well, for small countries, it's a combination of what is that country standing with China or the United States? If a country standing with China is quite strong, then that's going to probably preclude the United States from being able to establish port or penetrate, and likewise holds case for China. The other dimension is the political fragility of a country, whereas I think the United States and China both have the view that the higher the degree of political fragility in a country, even though it might offer some good security benefits, if you can get a base there, want to be away from it because of the possibility that you'll put $1 billion of investments in there, end up with another regime, and you don't have the certainty. So for the United States and China, the bases that we'll be looking for are ones that can provide good communications. We can get an intelligence set up there. Ones that are amenable to high tech. We can perform ammo stockage, conduct repairs, maintenance. You will want an airfield to be in that area. You get synergy from that. You need security in the area. And you need a host nation government that is going to be very comfortable with trying to keep the media not highlighting your presence there.
Perfect. All right. Well, time ran out. Again, gentlemen, thank you so much for the great insights on the geopolitics of infrastructure. Thank you. Thank you all.